This is Chapter 13, Section 1, the Introduction to Evolution. We live in a world today that, if we think about it, is very different than the world was maybe 1,000 years ago, or 6,000 years ago, or for sure 200 million years ago. We know climates have changed over time. We know, for instance, that the Sahara Desert, this section of Africa here has changed significantly over time, and that the Sahara Desert has actually been growing larger over the last 1,000 years. We know that at one point the entire world was dominated by aquatic life and there wasn't much on land. We know that as a human, living 1,000 years ago was a little more difficult than living today. Or even 6,000 years ago, things were quite a bit harsher and not as easy. So things change, and that means that the requirements for survival also change as our environment changes. And because of that, there's a huge variation in organisms in their ability to be able to survive. So variation is a natural process. We have natural variations in diversity within individuals in a population, as you can see in the photo, and if you even just look around our classrooms, there's a huge amount of diversity within how people are, their skin color, eye color, hair color, everything, height, everything changes. And some of those natural variations, can be an advantage for an organism. If you happen to live in a place where the sun is really strong, then being able to tan really well is an advantage because it protects your skin from the damaging rays of the sun. If you look at other organisms, this is an example of a Cuban tree snail, one species, and these are natural variations within that species. So they can change. These are just basically traits that are inherited from parents to offspring. They can be yellow, they can be orange, they can be patterned in different ways and have lots of striping or not very much striping. They can be bigger, they can be smaller. So there's a lot of things that go on within a population, and a lot of different types of organisms, traits that you can see. And because, let's see, I'm not going to worry about showing video right now. We're going to do that in class. With this huge variety of traits that are out there, it's easy to see that some traits are going to be beneficial and some traits maybe not so beneficial. For instance, if you're living in the Arctic, you're going to want to have a really warm, thick coat of hair to protect you from the cold. However, if you're living in the rainforest, having a really thick, heavy coat like that would probably be bad for you. Okay, so each organism has to adapt to the surroundings and the environment in which it is living. If you look at feathers, birds have a huge variety of feathers. Some birds have a whole bunch of insulating feathers underneath their outer feathers that help to keep them warm. Other birds have really elaborate decorative feathers that they use for attracting a mate. Some birds have very strong flight feathers so that they can fly really fast. So there's a huge variety of things that you can see depending upon the needs of the organism itself. Those that are best able to survive their lifetime, in theory, should be able to pass on some of these traits to their offspring. And those that are not able to survive very well, are going to die and not pass on any traits to their offspring. And so this is how you see maybe changes occur within species over time, because as the environmental stressors of survival impact an organism, the individual inherited traits will, basically determine how well that organism survives, and those traits therefore get passed on to offspring and become more prevalent in the population. By definition, an adaptation is an inherited trait that helps an organism to survive. All right, so it's something that you get from your parents, and it's somehow able to make you more successful as an organism in your lifetime. Okay, and that can be anything from you're stronger, your arms are longer, like if you're a monkey, your sight is really good, or you have fur that protects you from prickles on a particular tree that you need to climb. Whatever, it can be any variety of things. It can also be behavioral, in that it can be how you attract a mate, or maybe how you raise your children might make you and your babies more successful. Okay? So adaptations can include things like body structure, how they move, how they protect themselves. Again, I'm going to show videos in class, so don't worry about these right now unless you just want to go do them on your own. As a reminder, because we've had this definition before, a species is a group of organisms living in the same geographic area that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. That's all it is, okay? And it's important that the babies can have babies. By definition, evolution is a process in which inherited characteristics within a population change over generations, sometimes giving rise to new species. Okay, so it's how inherited characteristics change over time. And this is a really big evolutionary tree that starts, as far back as scientists could possibly think to go in when Earth first came to be, to the origins of the first cells, the first prokaryotic cells to the first eukaryotic cells, and so on and so forth. And then out on the outer edges of this tree are what life exists today, basically. This is the stuff that you find sort of like on the perimeter here. That's us at the top there. And then we've got other stuff around here. And all of these organisms exist right now on the perimeter. The stuff that's in the middle are common ancestors that all of us may have had way back when. Okay? So here's another example of how ancestry and fossils can play a role in, determining how things may have evolved. Here is an organism, the Eohippus, that existed about 60 million years ago. And some of you may be able to pick this out, or maybe might recognize the root, hippus right here, maybe recognize that. This is the animal that gave rise to the modern horse. And there's a few other species between the modern horse and Eohippus, but Eohippus, like I said, was 60 million years ago, and then you have Myohippus 40 million years ago, and then I can never say that right, Merychippus 25 million years ago, and then Pileohippus 7 million years ago, and then the horse today. Evolution, though, is not necessarily a straight shot. I mean, like you see in what I just showed you with the horses. Oftentimes, there's a lot of branching that occurs. And scientists hypothesize that all life forms evolved from a common ancestor, and that new species branch off from earlier species. And some species will have a branch that dead ends and doesn't continue forming, or may stay the same for millions of years, whereas other groups might have branches that just continue to branch and rebranch like all over the place. Okay, it just all depends on the environment the organisms are in, and sometimes on the a bit on what the organism is. Scientists can look at cells as an indicator for common ancestry, because cells all have certain things in common, and that supports that all cells may have come from one sort of, primordial, ancient, cell that gave rise to everything kind of thing. Because basically all cells have a similar cell membrane and structure. All cells, or many cells, have the same type of cellular respiration to make energy for themselves. and all cells have DNA as their hereditary material. And these similarities make it easy for scientists to kind of say, well, you know, they're so alike, surely they all must have had a common ancestor. This takes us to cladograms. And you need to know these terms. An ancestor is an organism from which others have descended. That's pretty basic. But a cladogram is actually a visual display of the evolutionary relationship among living species and their ancestors. And it looks sort of like a branch on a tree where one side's really straight. Okay? It looks like this. And you'll see that you have one side that kind of is continuous, the side over here. And then you have little branching events happening off of it, all right? And each branching event coincides sort of with a particular characteristic. For instance, you know, on this one, we're starting with a common ancestor to all of these organisms at some point in the past. And then the frog, the group of organisms that become frogs branched off of it here. But you still had organisms that could lay eggs with a shell. So that meant that there was another group of organisms that kind of branched off that included your snakes and other reptiles. And then there was a trait that came up that allowed organisms to be warm-blooded, and that had a branch-off event that gave rise to kangaroos. And then there was a characteristic known as a placenta, which made it possible for organisms to carry their developing babies inside of them for a long period of time until they were fairly well developed. And that gave rise to mammals and the group that produced the squirrel. So this is a cladogram. Yes? All right, here's another timeline. It's a different, simpler view to the evolutionary tree that I showed you on one of the previous slides. This is just a single line showing, you know, Earth 4.6 billion years ago, the first prokaryotic cell 3 billion years ago. Remember, those are the cells that don't have any membrane-bound structures, no nucleus, no mitochondria. And then you have the first eukaryotic cells about 2 billion years ago. And then the first multicellular organisms about 1 billion years ago. The first animals and then dinosaurs and then mammals. Mammals came about 65 million years ago. And then humans about 40,000 years ago. So we're relatively recent in the grand scheme of things. There are certain lines of evidence that scientists go to prove the theory of evolution. These include comparative anatomy, DNA analysis, and the fossil record. And so I'm going to go through each of these to kind of talk about how scientists use them. The first one we're going to talk about has to do with anatomy, or structures that organisms have, and how we compare them. All right. So by definition, comparative anatomy is the study of anatomical similarities and differences among species. So what does your arm have in common with other sort of limbs on other organisms? That's one way to look at it. Or what does your eye have in common with other eyes that other organisms have? Things like that. There's two terms that I want you to be able to recognize. One is analogous. An analogous structure is something that has a similar function, but not necessarily evolved from a common ancestor. Okay? And that is similar to what we were just looking at the last slide with the picture of the moth wing and the bird wing. And I'll show you another picture in a second. Homologous structures are structures that maybe are not always exactly the same in function, but very likely, due to their structure, had a common ancestor. Okay, that these probably did evolve from a common ancestor. So here, let's show you some examples of that. Okay. All right. Again, analogous structures are those that serve similar functions but evolved independently. So if we look at these guys down here, these are analogous. Okay, this bird wing and this fly wing both serve the function of flight. However, because of their structures, I mean, the birds have bones in them, the fly does not, we don't believe that they had a common ancestor. All right, but if you look at these guys. Okay, all of those, the human arm, the bird wing, the porpoise flipper, the elephant leg, all of those seem very similar. And in fact, I have a better picture. Here we go, because this is color coded. All of these structures here, the human arm, the cat leg, the dolphin flipper, and the bat wing, have a radius and an ulna. See, these are the red and blue ones. Okay, have carpals, which are these little turquoise ones, which are your wrist bones basically, but they're in different places in other organisms. Little tiny bit right there. Have metacarpals, which are these guys, purple ones, and they have phalanges. So that's pretty cool. Oops, sorry, I meant to make that one green. That's phalanges. Are the little fingery bits on the ends. Okay. So structurally, all of these are very similar, and so we believe that all of these organisms likely had a common ancestor. It's another view showing an elephant again, and you can see the same bone structures are present in all of these. So those are homologous structures. Another thing that comparative anatomists use is embryonic development. If we look at like the group of organisms known as vertebrates, the ones that have backbones, they actually go through very similar stages in their embryonic development. And if we actually took pictures of embryos side by side at an early stage of development for almost all vertebrates, they would look almost identical. For instance, look at this picture here. Okay, you've got a fish, a calf, and a rabbit all side by side, and they're almost all exactly the same. And so that indicates to scientists that these probably had a common ancestor. We're going to be playing this game in class. That's kind of fun. So if you're not in class, you may want to take a look at that because it's kind of an interesting little guess the embryo game. Adult vertebrates also share many similarities in their skeletons and in their muscles, and you saw some of that in the homologous structures we were just looking at. Other lines of evidence. Organisms that are more closely related tend to have DNA that's very similar. And so if the more similarities you have between DNA in different organisms, the more closely related you tend to believe those organisms are. For instance, this graph or this chart is looking at the differences in base sequences for the gene of hemoglobin. Okay, hemoglobin is a protein that carries oxygen in the red blood cells. So they're looking just specifically at that particular protein and the gene that codes for that protein. Well, between humans and eels, they have a difference of 125 bases for the protein, for the gene that makes hemoglobin. Dogs have a difference of only 32 bases. Chimpanzees only differ from us with this hemoglobin gene by 8 bases. Okay, so we're almost identical in our DNA sequence except for just 8 bases when it comes to hemoglobin. Okay, so we're very closely related. Therefore, scientists believe we're very closely related to chimpanzees, and a little more closely related to dogs, and then a little more closely related to birds after that, and then farther on down the line we become more and more distantly related. Here's another view of DNA comparing base sequences. You can see humans and chimps side by side, and the colored spots, these guys indicate places where there are differences. So in all of those base sequences and all of those bases, there's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 differences between us and a chimp. Pretty significant. And then similarly, we're very close to gorillas as well. Here's another chart that shows percentages of similarities. So you can see that humans and chimps are well into the 90s, and gorillas are not far behind. as far as how close we are in common with each other. The last thing we're going to talk about is the fossil record and how fossils play a role in proving evolution. A fossil, by definition, is a remnant or a trace of an organism from the past, such as a skeleton or an imprint embedded and preserved in the Earth's crust, often covered in sediments. And I know you learned about this in the past, how fossils form. You know, the tissues that were originally in the organism often get replaced by other minerals in the sediments and rocks around them, and thereby becoming rocks themselves, so to speak. And that's what we find today. Fossils found in the upper, newer sedimentary layers are more closely resemble present-day organisms than fossils found deeper. So the deeper you go, the older the fossils are. The more shallow you are, the newer your fossils are. And generally speaking, you know, when we look at the newer, more recent fossils, those organisms, we can see more clearly a resemblance to what exists today than the stuff that we find deeper in the sediment. And that's why when you look at the timeline for the horse, you know, over here, this is the modern day horse. And so the one closest in line in the fossil record just has a few things that are slightly different than the modern day horse. And if we go farther back, they're a little more different, and farther back, they're a little more different. So, and that sort of scenario plays out regularly. By studying the fossil record, scientists can make a timeline of life that is known from things that aren't very old and very similar to life today to things that are much older and not so similar. It's just a way of piecing together how changes may have occurred, and therefore how organisms may have evolved. Here's one that's fun. For instance, the largest land mammal that ever lived, Indricotherium, between 37 to 23 million years ago, we think it's probably an ancestor to the modern day elephant. There is a middle organism that existed about 8.5 to 2.7 million years ago, known as Dinotherium. And that one we can definitely see there was some resemblances from it to the modern elephant. And we think that this is how the elephant has evolved over the last 40 million years. Kind of cool, yeah? I kind of wish I had one of these guys. They're really cute. Anyway, our possible tree, we are, as it said, most closely related to the great apes, the chimpanzees and the gorillas. We had a branching event maybe 30 million years ago that gave rise to some of the lesser monkeys. And then older world monkeys branched off a little farther back. New world monkeys a little farther back. And then way back, you know, close to like probably 80 million years ago, there was a branching event that gave rise to the lemurs and the lorises and tarsiers. And that's all we got for this. That's a nice introduction to evolution. We're going to be talking in the next section a little more about what drives this evolutionary process and how it can actually occur. So till then, see ya.